This is Endless Horizons, a Gaslamp, steampunk serial by Leland Artra, Book 1, Impossible Paradise, created by text-to-audio technology.
Chapter 6, A Quiet Moment. Sir? Sir? I'm very sorry to make you recall all this again.
No, lady. It was a very long time ago. Time heals. If you'll excuse me, I need to use the head.
Excuse me, Your Highness.
Yes?
He's crying in the private. What should we do?
We'll wait. A lot of good people died, and he was at the heart of it from the beginning. Give him time and don't mention this to him. Honor. We must treat him with the greatest honor. The Empress stressed that.
He's coming back, milady.
Good. Perhaps some fresh Java for us both.
Pardon me, ma'am. Sorry I took so long. Things don't work as fast when you get older, if you know what I mean.
Of course, sir.
Oh, some fresh Java. Thank you. Now, where was I? Just getting to engineering, right? Well, as you can guess, it didn't solve a thing. Most of the tools, gear, and spare parts in the machine shop had been washed out of that second breach. We were near the edge of the world, practically out of food with one working propeller, 2 working engines, no rudder to steer, no engineers, and a handful of small tools. We cut the power to the screw and kept the boiler burning enough to run the pumps and provide steam for some of the other machinery. After that, we were drifting until we could fix the broken propeller or the rudder. I'd have been happy with either. Chapter 7.
Samudite 8, 14343, Day 13.
Reinvo watched over the stern as Father Benali was hauled up from his attempt at trying to bang the rudder free. There was no shortage of volunteers to attempt to fix the rudder, but the crew was getting desperate. Father Benali wasn't the first to work on the rudder until he collapsed, the priest's arms dangling at his sides as the repair crewman pulled him back on deck. A 5-pound anvil hammer swung freely on its securing line below him. Commander Ardley approached. His face told Reinvo everything he needed to know. When the priest works himself to exhaustion, you know the Star Empresses are not looking kindly on you. Chief Oiler Wanley walked past and gave a dark sideways glance at Reinvo. "Oiler!" he blasted. Wanley spun, not bothering to come to attention. "Sir?" Reinvo stepped up to him. "Have you forgotten how to salute so fast?" Wanley sneered. "Don't see why I should. We're all cursed. That Cobb, Jana Lee, cursed us all. The Star Empresses will see to it we all fall off the edge of the world on this abomination of hers." Reinvo had to unclench his fists. "Lady Jana Lee will not be spoken of in such a manner. If I hear you speaking like this again, I'll toss you over the edge myself." Wanley shrugged and saluted limply. "Yes, sir." Commander Ardley snapped straight. "You're on report." "Being on report means little if we're all dead," Wanley mumbled, just loud enough to be heard. Reinvo pointed. "Get out of my sight, Mr. Wanley." Wanley shuffled away. "I've meant to speak to you on this, Captain. Many of the crew are more than worried about the edge. Father Benali is starting to stir up more unrest." Reinvo leaned against the gunwale. "Put the looser lips on hammer duty. I doubt any of them will have the energy to cause trouble after trying to fix the rudder with a hammer." Ardley saluted and started to move off, but stopped and looked back. "Captain, I checked the charts. We passed the fall point last night." Reinvo looked at the broad ocean around them. "I know. I don't understand it either. None of the crew is trained in navigational math, but a few of the older men are experienced enough to have a general feel for it. So what do we do? The falls exist. There are dozens of ships that attempted to explore them that went over. The last was only 200 years ago. That boat had hundreds of witnesses." "Witnessed, yes, but they went over the western edge, which is visible from the summit of Caerfyrden Island. I don't recall any attempts northerly, and the Empire made the 100-mile restriction after that." "You think there are no falls to the north?" "Commander, that's heresy. Just say we are skirting them in this current we're stuck in." Chapter 8. Samudit 13, 14343, Day 18. Port, land ho. Captain Reinvo stuffed the charts back into the navigation cabinet and made sure it was locked before he moved to look. There was a fresh breeze blowing through the bridge with both doors open, but it wasn't enough to hide the stench of his sweat. Rubbing his eyes, he glared out into the burning, bright daylight. They'd been drifting for 15 days since reaching the engine room. Running the engines was useless with only one drive shaft working and no rudder. The V Brios could only move forward or backward in a narrow half-degree turn to starboard, and that was towards the edge of the world. He'd considered detaching the rudder and letting it drop into the ocean, but there was nothing to replace it with, and he wasn't sure the keel would be enough to keep the ship straight. Worse, straight was also towards the edge of the world. The gearing had been damaged, making it impossible to reverse the one working propeller. A few crewmen had made it their hobby to sit and stare at the gears, discussing how to fix them without tools. So far, no feasible ideas had come forth. They'd taken what measures they could. The crew was on minimal rations, and no one was allowed to work themselves into exhaustion again. The only thing that worked so far was keeping everything tidy. It didn't use a lot of energy and kept a semblance of normalcy, bolstering the crew's morale. Lieutenant Metallo was half propped up at the rear of the bridge, his head leaning against his navigational chart cabinet, a soft snoring sound coming from him. The ocean breeze did little to alleviate the repressive heat. The crew had set up lounging locations in what shade they could find. Below deck, the heat reached levels that rivaled the best steam baths back in the capital city. Out of the shade, the sun baked any that dared to move. "Land ho!" The call burst into the room again. This time it was taken up by more voices. Off to the port side of the ship, a tall black mountain rose out of the sea. A ribbon of bright green encircled the foot of the mountain like an emerald necklace. Two smaller bright green islands flanked the larger central island. "You're a beautiful sight," Reinvo said to the mountain. He thought about the climbing gear he had in his cabin. He wasn't sure if it was in usable shape. Still, that tall black peak made his hands twitch with the desire to climb it and see what it wanted to show him. "Natives, to arms," someone called. "No," Captain Reinvo said. But it only came out a whisper, his throat as dry as a dusty road. He shuffled out of the bridge to stand on the narrow strip of deck just forward of the bridge windows. He swallowed, getting his throat working. "Stand down. Arm yourselves, but don't attack. They may be friendly." "No!" Returning to the bridge, he pulled his pistol belt from its locker. Climbing down, he moved across the tilting deck to where the crew had already brought out a rope ladder. He nodded and helped them secure it, letting it roll out and dangle from the starboard side closest to the water. He'd never seen boats like the three coming out. Two were enormous canoes with a pair of bowed poles that connected to a second float runner. The large central boat was made of two even larger canoes, connected by thicker poles with a tight woven mat stretched between the boats, making a solid central floor that was as large as two cargo lorries. All three boats were rowed by strong-backed, barely dressed men. In the center of the larger boat platform sat an ornately carved, dark wooden chair occupied by an impressive figure of a man who wore a brightly colored skirt, a type of bead wrap on both ankles, and a vertical fan of blue feathers behind his head. The native chief, also, had uncountable golden rings, earrings, and brightly colored beads braided into his long black hair. 4 men stood in a half-circle behind the chief, feet wide, all dressed about the same. The natives circled the boat, stopping to touch the hull in places. Finally, through gestures, Reinvo managed to invite them up. Standing well back, he ordered his men to keep pistols and rifles down.
The chief climbed up but did not step onto the deck. Instead, he stayed on the top rung of the rope ladder.
"Minwana, mortusi un oya hauni," he said slowly, like someone talking to a child. "We will not harm you. Can you help us?" Reinvo said slowly, stepping forward. He kept his pistol in its holster, holding his hands out, palms up, like some of the southern tribes he'd visited did in greeting. The chief looked him over, and his eyes examined the gold and colored decorations on Reinvo's uniform. After inspecting the rest of the visible crew, he shouted something incomprehensible to the others on his boat. Another native climbed up the ladder behind the chief and handed him a bright red ball. With slow, deliberate steps, and watching everyone carefully, the chief stepped over the gunwale. Holding the red ball before him, he slowly drew an obsidian blade with a bone handle. Ardley stepped up next to the captain and started drawing his pistol. Reinvo held up a hand to stop him. "Wait," he commanded. The chief eyed Ardley and stared at the commander's hand, or perhaps the pistol he was gripping. Using the knife, he cut the red ball in half. Bright green juices squirted out and stained the decking. Slipping the obsidian blade back into its sheath, the leader held one half of the fruit out to Reinvo. "Hilp, in pace oyar well om," he said deliberately, then gently shook the extended hand holding the fruit half. "That sounded like Ventalian. How can he know our language?" Ardley asked. The chief's eyes narrowed and his brows lowered. "Yes, it did. Careful what you say. If I heard that right, I think it was the ancient greeting of the Star Empresses, or at least a reasonable chunk of it." Reinvo moved closer and slowly reached for the fruit. The man smiled widely, showing a large set of gleaming white teeth and allowing Reinvo to take the fruit. Reinvo smelled the strange berry. It had green and orange meat with no discernible seeds. It smelled like a strawberry mixed with a savory spice. The native took a bite of his half, pulling back and leaving the skin in place. His teeth scooped a sizable chunk of the fruit's meat out. With a broad grin, he chewed, letting the juices run down his hairless chin. Reinvo took a smaller bite. Fruit juice as sweet as apple rolled over his parched mouth and lubricated his throat. The fruit's meat was thick and chewy but fell apart after a moment. Even if he hadn't been starving, it would have tasted fantastic, having only eaten salty sea biscuits and precious dried fruit slices in the last week. It was a taste worth more than gold. Behind him, he could feel the crew's eyes ravenously consuming the fruit in his hand. But he couldn't bring himself to feel guilty at tasting the delectable fruit. Its juices were a balm on his tongue and throat. The meat of it made it to his stomach, causing a sudden, almost undeniable urge to devour the remains in his hand. Only his years of forced discipline kept him from insatiably taking another bite. "Empresses, that is amazing." "Well, the leader said, throwing his remaining fruit over the side. Gasps came from the crew at the wasteful squander. The chief may have been well fed, but Reinvo wasn't. As the leader apparently didn't care about the rest, Reinvo wouldn't stop. He took another bite. Behind the native chief, the other native gasped, as did more of the Vibrius's crew behind him, although he was sure they were for entirely different reasons, and Reinvo's attention went sharply to the natives. The lead native frowned and glared at Reinvo. "What?" The two natives got into a quick argument, which ended with the chief making a chopping motion, cutting the other one off. The chief indicated the fruit and pointed at the ocean. His brows tightened as he slowly mouthed, "For Kanishasa, blessed she walls." Reinvo puzzled over it for a moment. "I think Kanishasa is a person," Ardley whispered. The chief glared at Ardley, reaching for his knife. Reinvo held up his hand. If he recalled correctly, the Star Empress's ancient greeting did offer a shared table. Maybe these natives took it very literally. He did his best to remember the full greeting. "In peace, we come. In humility, we give for your table. In the name of the Empresses, we serve." As he said the last, he tossed the fruit over the side. The chief let out a rolling caterwaul, throwing his arms wide and making Ardley and Reinvo jump back. The noise startled the crew so much they didn't even move. The chief laughed and spoke in his rolling vowel-filled language over his shoulder. The other man with him frowned and then climbed down. "We help." Two new men climbed up, each carrying a sack, and stepped boldly over the gunwale. The leader took the bags and held them out to Reinvo, saying, "Trade you." He let Reinvo take one lumpy bag. It was made from a woven fibrous plant material, but felt as strong as a burlap sack. Opening the sack showed that it was full of those red fruits. Reinvo's mouth watered. "We should shoot them and take their food," Chief Oiler Wanley whispered to someone nearby. The chief and one of the men with him frowned and glared at Wanley, their hands moving for their knives. These natives might not be able to speak Ventalian clearly, but the Empresses knew they could understand it. "Commander, place Wanley under arrest and take his firearm," Reinvo ordered. Ardley turned to Wanley, drawing his pistol faster than Wanley or the natives could react. "Don't tempt me, mister. I've wanted to throw you over the side for weeks." In a few seconds, Ardley and 3 crew members had taken Wanley away. Reinvo considered the natives who watched this without comment, hands hovering near the obsidian knives and yet barely moving. They were both strong and probably skilled warriors. Warriors that were still deciding if dealing with the V. Brios was safe. The cargo holds had plenty of trade goods, and they needed food. So he stepped forward, free palm out, his other hand gently shaking the sack of fruit. "Trade we oo," he said, imitating the natives' pronunciations. The chief laughed and slapped Reinvo's shoulder hard. "Hilpoo," he said, pointing to the large island. He hit the deck railing and pointed at the empty masts above them. Then the chief put his hands out to the sides, palms down, and tilted till he was parallel to the V. Brios's listing deck. He then straightened back to true level. "Fis oo raf," he said finally. Commander Ardley had returned in time to see the strange act. "What does that mean?" Reinvo laughed and held his hand out. "Yes, trade we oo. Empresses bless us, we might make it home yet." Ardley whispered, "What is going on?" "I think they can repair the V. Brios." "Have you lost your mind?" Ardley said incredulously.
Want more? Go to reamstories.com/endlesshorizons to get early access to more of the Endless Horizons adventures. Before you go, please rate, review, and comment on these chapters. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening. These audio readings are produced with text-to-audio technology to keep costs down. Want to support producing these with greater frequency and eventually using voice actors? There are two options. One, and my personal favorite, to support the writing, editing, and audio production, get early access to draft stories, and participate in the amazing community of listeners and fans of these serials, please go to reamstories.com/endlesshorizons and subscribe. Or, two, to specifically support just audio production of these serials, please go to patreon.com/LARTRA and become an audio production patron. The subscription model helps sustain the serial writing projects and all their associated costs. Again, thank you for listening.